climate change is arguably one of the biggest threats facing wildlife globally in this country, in the Peak District. We're an upland area, but we're very much at the southern southeastern limits of upland areas in Britain, so consequently we're at the southeastern limit of a lot of different habitats and species. So potentially there's a lot of things that could be really quite vulnerable to climate change in the Peak. There's been a lot of analysis of birds, breeding birds at a European scale, and what their climate envelope might be, where the suitable areas of climate might be for them in 2080. And that's predicting something like a 500 kilometre shift northwards and eastwards in bird populations. So a lot of our upland birds on the Peak District moors, which are such an important element of our biodiversity at the moment, are quite vulnerable to that change. Several ways in which we can really try and manage for climate change and how it affects wildlife. One is there may be certain species for which climate change is really going to sign the death knell, and it may not be worth investing further conservation effort. Trying to assess that and which species that might apply to is extremely difficult. A second way is trying to, and probably the most important way, is just trying to get the existing habitats that we've got into good condition, into the best condition that we can, because that will allow things to adapt to climate change more. So for example, one of the plants that we particularly value in the Peak District, Jacob's Ladder, it grows in some of the limestone dales, and it tends to grow on north-facing slopes. It tends to be a more northerly species and is restricted to the more humid north-facing slopes. Peak District probably supports the largest populations in Britain of it, but because it's a northern species, it may be vulnerable to climate change. And the way I think we would look at managing for those sorts of species is to try and manage the dales to get them into optimum condition, accepting that, okay, it may be vulnerable to climate change, it may go from some sites, but there will still be pockets. If the land is in good condition, there will still be pockets where it can hang on and survive. And of course a lot of our existing wildlife and our existing rarer species that we value now are rare precisely because of that sort of issue of climate change in the past, and they will be clinging on to the best remaining places from a much more widespread distribution in the past, when the climate perhaps more widely would have been more amenable to them. So getting land into good condition so that wildlife can adapt to it is probably one of the most important things we can do. We can also look at facilitating the spread of species by looking at habitat corridors, stepping stones, trying to make the land in between the good bits of habitat more amenable for wildlife to be able to pass through, to migrate through, to migrate along hedgerows, things like that, so that if one site becomes unsuitable, then they've got a number of other options open to them. Another important way that we can adapt or help wildlife try and adapt to climate change is recognising that there will be change and accepting that and saying, okay, well, we may lose some of the species that we currently have in the Peak District, but there will be others that we can gain if they've got the right habitat and the right conditions. So, for example, Dartford warbler is a species that's very much been associated with southern Britain, with southern heathlands in the past. Now, for the first time, for a long time in the Peak District, we had a pair breeding on the edge of the Peak District the year before last. They have particular habitat requirements, and if we can start to manage some of our existing habitats a little bit more flexibly with those types of species in mind that we may get spreading in, then that will encourage those new species and allow them climate space to spread northwards. So we've started to adopt that approach, for example, on some of the moorlands in the Peak District, where instead of thinking about the current range of moorland species we've got, we've begun thinking, well, maybe in the future some of the wildlife will be more akin to the sort of lowland heaths of southern Britain. And those types of species often like a moorland, a woodland, a heathland fringe, whereas the open moorland species, they like the open moors, they tend not to like trees. So we're beginning to manage some of our moorlands a little bit more perhaps like you manage southern heathlands, to encourage those sort of species to spread northwards.